composting, there are just 4 basic ingredients for any backyard compost pile. That's carbon, nitrogen, air, and water. Carbon comes from materials such as leaves, newspaper, dead plants. Those things tend to be pretty high in carbon. Your nitrogen comes from materials such as grass clippings, food scraps, alfalfa, probably not a very common material for people, but food scraps can be a great source of nitrogen along with grass clippings for someone who might live in the suburbs or in the city. So, and a good compost pile needs a chemical ratio of 20:1. Well, I doubt that you really want to go out and analyze your leaves or analyze your grass clippings. So a simple rule of thumb is to think 2 parts green material to 1 part brown material. The green materials are the nitrogen-rich materials I mentioned before, such as grass clippings, green plants, and food scraps. And the brown materials are those carbon-rich materials, such as leaves or straw, hay, or even newspaper, if that's what you've got. Then the next step would be to decide where you want your compost. And I always recommend starting your compost pile in a place that's convenient to you. In my compost pile at home, I add food scraps about once a week. So I've put my compost in a part of my backyard that's easy to get to. I wouldn't put it in the farthest corner of my backyard because I don't want to do anything to make it harder on myself to add materials to the pile. Having a container or some sort of structure will help to keep your pile more uniform. So not only does it look a little bit nicer, but it can help your pile heat up. And your pile, why does your pile need to heat up? Well, a good compost pile will give off heat as the material starts to break down. And to really allow for heat to break up, think about making your pile have the capacity of a cubic yard. So think about a pile that's 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, and that can get you started. The earth machine has a capacity of about a cubic yard when full. So it can be a good place for beginners and people who don't want to take the time to construct a bin. So you've got your carbon-rich materials, you've got your nitrogen-rich materials, which you might choose to save up in a bucket such as this. I keep this underneath my sink. So you want to start your pile just by layering those materials, your brown materials and your green materials. And as you build those layers, add water. Any organic matter needs oxygen and water to break down. So you want to add water until your pile has the consistency of about like a wrung-out sponge. And then your final step is simply to monitor your pile. You might choose to turn your pile once a week to help the material break down faster. Ideally. And there's some commercial compost bins that have a crank, or they're built so that you can sort of kick them around on the ground to make turning even easier. And it's really kind of an experiment. I was just telling someone here at HerbFest that composting is an art, I think, as much as it is a science. So the more often you turn your pile, you're helping to introduce oxygen and help the material rot faster. If you turn your pile once a month, your compost will probably take longer to break down than if you turn your compost once a week. Like I said, composting you can put as much time into it as you want. Something like vermicomposting is a good option for people who don't have a lot of time. This worm bin, this is a very small one, and it's really my demonstration bin, but I don't have to do any aerating. The worms do all the work for me, and they help break down that material. Right. Generally, I don't recommend that people compost meat and bones and dairy products because they will break down, but they can give off odors and they might attract rodents. But if you've got a large open space and you don't have a lot of neighbors nearby, you could try composting meat because the material will rot, and as long as you don't mind the smell and aren't concerned about possibly attracting rodents, then the material will break down. For somebody who's got neighbors all around them like I do, I definitely couldn't recommend composting meat. I always recommend working with what you've got. In your case, you've got some really good sources because you do have chickens, as well as the food scraps left over from your family. Other people, might not be that fortunate. Somebody in a new development isn't going to have a lot of leaves in the winter. On the other hand, my home's an older home, got lots of mature trees in my yard. I always have oak leaves that I can compost. You can do either method. Building a pile all at once, like filling an earth machine, or even in my wire bins at home, when I can get enough material, I'll build an entire pile at once. And that's just because that's hot composting. And that's building a pile that's about a cubic yard is the way to go if you want it to heat up. So if I fill my wire bins, which are about 4 feet tall, I notice that after about 2 to 3 days, my pile is warm. It's warm to the touch. On the other hand, it's sometimes of the year I can't get enough brown and green material. So I actually have 3 compost bins going at home. One's a large pile that I started all at once, and I turn it about once a month, not as much as I should, and that material is breaking down. But I've got another bin where I'm just adding materials as I get them. So as I prune my bushes, I'm just dropping the material in there. When my azaleas finish blooming, I'll prune them, and I'll just put that material in there. And that's cold composting or passive composting. And some of my friends who are professional composters like to say compost happens, and it does. You know, it can happen very slowly. If you pile leaves in your yard and did nothing to them, in a year they're going to break down, and you've got a wonderful material that's added nutrients to the soil. On the other hand, if you need it compost in 4 months, then hot composting is the way to go. Trying to build that pile all at once and turn it once a week or every 2 weeks. That's going to have compost ready for you faster.